Hi! In this video we will talk about the King's Indian type 3 pawn structure. This structure is characterized by having pawns on c4, d5, and e4 versus pawns on c7, d6, and d5. We are used to seeing this pawn structure in the King's Indian defense, but I should say that it can actually occur in many other positions. For example, it could arise from the Bogo Indian and even certain lines in the Ruy Lopez. Now the most important idea here is that white will try to play against black's pawn chain. You see, so we have these pawns on c7, d6, and e5. Currently we have these two pawns blocking each other, the pawn on d5 and the pawn on d6. So then with white it would make sense to attack the base of the pawn chain by playing c5. This is the main plan. For black, we have a similar idea. Now in this case black would want to attack the base of the pawn chain by playing f5. So this is kind of a standard approach in this position. And then, in the examples, we will be able to see these ideas more clearly. So in this first video, we will see how to play this position from white's perspective. Now, let's start with the first example. So, okay, in this example, we will see white's main plan in action. So this game was played in 2015 between Grandmaster Vitaly Sivok and International Master Haridas Pasqua. It all started with a Petrosian variation of the King's Indian, which goes as follows. And now black opted for one of the main setups by playing a5, then h6. And okay, the opening is essentially over, and now we should talk a little bit about the main plans for the middle game. As we said before, white wants to play c4, c5, and he will want to push his a and b pawns in order to achieve this goal. Meanwhile, black is putting some pressure against the e4 pawn and, would like to continue someday by playing f5. Something that is worth mentioning is the position of white's bishop on h4. It's pretty well placed. Currently, it prevents the knight from getting away from this diagonal, so it basically makes it a bit harder for black to achieve the basic goal of playing f5. Now, the game continued in the standard way by playing b3. I should point out that a standard mistake is to play a3 in this position, which is actually, it seems very fast because then we can play b4 right away, but it's easily refuted by playing a4. So after black plays a4, then the only way white can even attempt to make progress is by playing b4, but then pawn takes, knight takes. And we can already see that white will never be able to push b4 and c5 in an optimal way. So this basic mistake of playing a3 a couple moves ago basically destroys white's main plan permanently. White should play b3 instead. Now after b3, the game continued with queen c8, getting away from the diagonal. Then queen c2, knight h7. Okay, and here we are. After a3, I'm going to play b4 next move. And here black has some options. So at this point, it might become a little bit clear that white's queenside play is going kind of a bit fast, whereas black's kingside play isn't really going anywhere that quickly. When this happens, sometimes black has to make a decision. Here's the big question. Should you take on e4 or should you push? When you push, then the pawn chain changes a little bit, right? Now we have f3, e4, and d5, and then the base is actually the f3 pawn, right? So you might consider something like bringing the pawn to g4 in order to hit the new base. This plan is actually pretty strong if you have time. But the problem is that it's pretty slow. I mean, you have to push the pawn to f4, then you have to bring the pawn all the way, and then build some pressure against f3. There is not always enough time for that. Instead, black in this position might have tried to just take on e4. Which isn't quite as strong, right? It's hard to put pressure against the e4 square, but at least it allows for some basic counterplay. So now we said, okay, pawn take, knight takes, bishop f5, bishop f2. Now white is actually threatening to maybe take on c5, which might create some unpleasant weaknesses. For example, the pawn on e5 would become isolated. Now a possible variation could have been knight takes, pawn takes, bishop g4. We trade. We have seen some simplification. Okay, black isn't doing too badly. I mean, the knight could come to f4 someday. But of course, white can still play c5, where he has some substantial advantage because he's already putting pressure against the d6 pawn, which is actually a lot weaker than the pawn on e4. The pawn on e4 is very hard to attack. But anyways, that would have been one possibility. Now going back a few moves, the game continued with knight a6, then rook b1, and b4. Okay, so here we have a few options. Black played b6, but let's for a moment consider what would have happened after g5. So we can play bishop f2, h5, and now white can play c5, the standard break. Now black can also achieve a standard break by playing g4. But now actually white is already kind of ahead because he has this strong move c6. So after c6, he has a pretty big advantage because the point is that if the opponent takes, then we can just take. And when the bishop takes, we just play b5, winning a piece. So going back a couple moves, after c6, black could just play bishop e8, then b5. Knight goes to c5, we can just take it. And now there are many convincing ways to win. For example, this is one of the simplest. I take on g4, then I take on b7, and then I take on g4. And black's position has completely fallen apart. Right, he's already a pawn down, the pawn on c5 is extremely weak. The queen side is very strong for me, very weak for black. I mean, there's really nothing for black to do. So, going back a few moves, we basically were able to rule out the idea of playing just g5, h5, and g4. So in the game, black instead attempted to stay by playing b6, hoping that this would make the c5 break a little bit weaker. Now, here white played bishop f2, which makes a lot of sense. We placed the bishop on h4 initially to make it a bit harder for black to progress, but black has already spent some tempo, for example by playing queen c8, just to get out of the diagonal. So once that has been achieved, then the bishop can regroup to f2 where it will support the c5 break. Now, if black had, for example, played pawn takes in this position, the game went rook f6, but let's suppose pawn take, and then rook f6. Now white has queen b3. And now he's actually ready to double rooks on the a file, which is very interesting because, for example, if you play g5, then I can just play rook a1. Notice that the knight cannot move anymore. If you move it, you lose the rook. So then maybe h5, I double. And after I do this, I'm already winning with white. There is nowhere for the knight to go. For example, if you play rook g6, I can just play queen a2. And that knight has been lost. So this is something that typically happens once you play b6. That's the problem with playing b6. The knight on a6 loses protection. So either way, the game continued with b6, bishop f2, and now black couldn't play pawn takes, so instead he just played rook f6 right away. And now white continued in a relatively standard way. First he traded. So as soon as he trades, now the c5 square is a little bit more accessible, and now white just played c5. So with this move, white is momentarily giving up a pawn. But the important thing is that now black's queenside pawn structure is completely destroyed, and it's essentially impossible for black to pursue a kingside attack. There are just too many weaknesses to worry about, and that's always the problem with black. It's like, if there are too many weaknesses on the queenside already, it's very hard to focus on creating an effective kingside attack. Now, let's see some variations. Typically, I would tell black, when this attack starts going, don't do anything on the queenside, just try to continue on the king side like nothing is going on. So let's see what would happen here. So g5, c6, rook b7. Well, you know, that recommendation I just gave typically works, but just to show you in this example, the reason that black didn't do this is because it's too late already. For example, I mean, you could continue with h5, hoping to get something going, but then I can just bring my other rook, you push, and then I can just take the knight. And the queen is trapped. Right? So this is just too tragic. But I mean, basically the reason that this happens is that the pawn already made it to c6 in a very optimal way. And then the other thing to notice is these bishops. They're just too strong. So if you could keep this position in your mind as a point of reference, that would be very helpful. This is a kind of position where you just can't let me keep going. So instead, black took on c5. And then of course we take. And now we have reached an important moment. So let's suppose you are playing white, and you obviously understand your position is much better, but how do you choose your next move? I mean, should you focus on getting the pawn back right away? Should you bring more pieces to the attack? That's always a difficult question. Now, for example, one possibility could be knight a4. Then the game might continue with bishop f8, I take, take, take. And then, you know, this seems very promising. In fact, it's actually winning. Because you see, black doesn't quite have time to stabilize the position. So if you play something like rook f7, I double. Okay, so now I'm attacking the pawn. Maybe you protect it with bishop f8. And when I play queen c3, I mean, suddenly the pawn on e5 is just lost. So the game is just lost. But going back a couple of moves, there's something that we didn't discuss. So after knight takes c5, black actually has c6, where things are really not that clear. I mean, because after c6, let's suppose that I were to take on c6, then some of the main weaknesses are gone, right? I mean, black managed to get rid of that weak pawn. Instead, the game might continue something like knight takes d7, I bring my rook, take, take. Of course, you cannot take on d5 because there is a diagonal and then you would lose your queen, but you might play rook c8 and knight g5. The reason for knight g5 is that it kind of makes it harder for white to play knight e4, which would be a massive move. And now white is certainly a lot better, but the game is kind of disorganized, and winning wouldn't be quite as easy as it could have been. So I'm not saying it's a bad move, I'm just saying I would discourage you from going into this if you have something cleaner. Now, going back a few moves, one pretty effective way to play here could have been to play knight c4. So you're attacking the pawn on e5, kind of disrupting black's opportunity to coordinate. Notice there is not enough time for bishop f8, bishop d6, because I mean the pawn is being attacked right away. And then maybe you play rook f8, knight a4. You see the difference with the previous variation? Now it's very hard to protect this pawn, and the game is pretty much over. I mean, just to show you an example, I mean the game could continue with queen a6. Okay, I take. Okay, this is a pin, so I get rid of that by playing d2. Then I get out of the pin. Knight e3. Okay, I'm attacking the pawn again, you see? So then maybe knight e8, and here I can just trade. And the black's position just falls apart. I mean, just too many things are falling. Right, so going back a few moves, the game continued in a different way. White decided to just play bishop b5, which is a very interesting approach. So black's primary focus is on winning control of light squares, which essentially kills black's kingside prospects, emphasizes just how useless black's dark squared bishop really is. I mean, notice this, bishop on g7 is pretty useless. Okay, so now after bishop b5, the game continued with knight f6. But let me point out that at first sight, it might seem interesting to play something a little bit different, maybe to play c6. So if you play c6 in this position, well, I mean, you're kind of getting rid of your double pawns, but then I can just take, and now I have a very strong move, knight d5. And it has a double threat, or a triple threat maybe. The knight could come to e7, f6, and b6. So in this position, black has to take, I take. Now, the knight is coming to e4, so you must play knight g5. But then after something like h4, knight e4, and bishop c6, black's position is just collapsing. Because you see, you will have to deal with this rook which is hanging, and then suddenly this pawn is falling, but then also the d pawn is just advancing very easily. Meanwhile, black is stuck. I mean, notice this pawn on e5. You see, white has an extra pawn on the d file, black has an extra pawn on the e file that just can't move anywhere. The bishop on g7 is trapped. The game is essentially lost. So going back a few moves, after knight f8, the game continued with knight c4. So then we take on b5, take, and now we just take. And here we could say that white's strategy has been a massive success. So why do we say this? I mean, notice, first of all, we were able to break on the queen side before black was even able to create anything on the king side. Right now we have a great control of light squares. The bishop on g7 is just completely stuck. There is a weakness on c7. We have a very strong pawn on d5, and essentially all my pieces are very well coordinated. Now the game continued with knight b8, take, take, knight d7. I mean, if I take, then I lose my knight on c4, which I don't like. But actually the game just continued with rook b1, knight b5. Okay, now there is some funny threats. So I just move my king away. I mean, the game could have continued with something like knight d3, but then knight d1, and there is nothing really to follow up. For example, if you play queen d4, I can just take on e5, then go to c6. I mean, black doesn't have enough pieces to make any substantial threats. So going back a little bit, the game here continued with a4, queen c6, and now we are threatening to place a knight on b5. So, well, knight b3, knight b5, queen b8, take on c7, and d6. You see, the last few moves maybe we review a little bit quickly, but it's very easy to understand that white's strategy has succeeded. Once we played this c5 so early in the game and that we were willing to sacrifice a pawn momentarily, I mean, the game was essentially decided. The rest was just a matter of playing with enough precision to block black's counterplay. Now, let's see another example. So, from this example, we might have got this overwhelming feeling that black maybe wasted a couple moves when he decided to put the knight on c5 and then go back. So in this example, we will see a very similar variation. In fact, so far we are in an identical position. And now black doesn't go for this thing. Well, the disadvantage is that now I can get to play maybe a3 first. The idea of a3 is to play b4 right away. I hope you noticed that at the end of the line there is a pin, so the knight cannot take on b4. So black plays bishop d7, threatening to play a4. Now b4 doesn't work, because you just take and then take with the knight. So here the game continued with b3. Okay, it's kind of similar to the previous example. Then knight h7, I castle, you play f5, I play f3. And again, you see, this bishop has been a little bit disruptive. It forced the queen to move, wasting a move. And then when I play f3, I'm ready to reroute the bishop to a nicer square on f2, where it will support c5. Now here the game continued with g5, bishop f2, rook b1. Well, in the previous game, white included the move queen c2, right? But this is really not necessary, and I hope you understand that, the overall goal here is to just play b4 and c5. Everything else will just be played if it's necessary. Otherwise, it will be omitted for the sake of speed. Now the game continued with h5. It's kind of like a race. Now b4. And now black decided to take on b4, but he didn't need to. An alternative could have been to play queen g6, c5, g4. And now white's best chance is probably to play c6. So then you can maybe take, and I take, and then I get to play b5, which is very ugly for black, because after I play b5, you have a choice between going to b8, where the knight would essentially be dead forever, nowhere to go, and the rook would also be dead forever, or you can go to c5, where I will take, and I can even play b6 right now. And you see, the main thing here is that, again, white has been able to create good play on the queen side, to the point that black can't really focus on his kingside attack. That's the key. So then essentially the position is lost. Besides, I have so many nice moves, like a knight coming to d5, a knight coming to c4, and then a rook is entering the game as well. So going back a few moves. After b4, black decided to take and to play b6. And as a general rule, I would say that if black has to make this move, then things aren't going too well. This move doesn't really prevent c4, c5 break, but now the knight on a6 is also a target, which white will actually exploit very quickly. So he played bishop d3, g4, then queen e2. So then the idea is to play c5, and now the knight is hanging. So here, black could have played bishop c8, but then I can get to play rook a1. Okay, now you're threatening my pawn on b4, so I can play rook a4. And then when you try to protect more, I just bring my other rook. And then you see, I'm just preparing this c5 break. Sooner or later, it will be too strong to be stopped. So going back a little bit, the position after queen e2 was followed by queen g6, c5, knight g5. Now, please notice that if I go for bishop takes a6, which might seem tempting, then black can just take, and when I take, then rook takes a6, which is actually a very complex position. My king side got a little bit damaged permanently, and black was able to get rid of that weak knight, and now instead has a rook coming to a3, which would be very unpleasant. So going back a few moves, after knight g5, white just gets to play king h1, the knight is attacked, so he goes to b8, and then I play c6. The point is that after bishop c8 and bishop h4, black is just lost. Because you see, white's queenside play was a success. He managed to place a pawn on c6. This changes the pawn chain a little bit, right? When we place a pawn on c6, then suddenly the base is no longer d6, but rather c7. c7 is just very hard to protect. And when the pawn is lost, it will be lost sooner or later, then the pawn on c6 will just be promoting. Now, there are a couple items to notice. Here, white can just play, for example, rook a1, trade rooks, and then place a rook on a8. The knight on b8 is just defenseless, right? And in fact, the bishop on c8 is also very hard to move. So for all these reasons, black actually resigned. At first, it might have seemed like a premature decision, but once we take all these little factors into consideration, I think it's very well understood. Something kind of memorable about this position is how we placed the bishop on h4 at the beginning to obstruct the attack, and then the final move is also bishop h4, with the idea of actually getting ahead of moves like g3 or h4. Essentially putting the entire kingside flank to a stop and allowing white to just make more progress with maybe bringing the rook or the knight to b5 to attack the pawn on c7. So overall, I think these past two examples show just how powerful this c4, c5 idea is. I think it's a plan with a very strong strategic foundation. And if black just waits around, his position will always be hopeless. And this plan cannot be neutralized. The only way for black to play is to find some solid counterattack, and it will always have this nature of kind of a race. And that's what we will see in the next video. So see you next time.